This is the third talk in the series on house churches. In the first talk we looked at house churches for today, and the question we raised was, what is the biblical basis for house churches? In talk number 2 we looked at the implementation of house churches today, and the question we raised there was, how do we set up a house church within our community? Now in this third talk, which we're going to call Key Characteristics of House Churches, the question is, what distinguishes the house church from the more traditional church? The word church and house occur together in the same sentence 4 times in the New Testament, in Romans 16, 1 Corinthians 16, Colossians 4 and Philemon. And this is a powerful reminder that the house church was the basic building block of first century Christianity, and that all other activities flowed from this idea. Now the key characteristics of house churches, number 5. They are size, style, simplicity, self-replication and strategy. And we shall look at these in some detail. And what we'll find is that these key characteristics distinguish the house church from the more traditional church. And when we have looked at these 5 key characteristics in some detail, we shall return to that theme, how that these characteristics distinguish the house church from the more traditional church. So, characteristic first of all is size. The house church is always relatively small. When it has reached between 10 and 20 people, depending of course on the size of the house, it is ready to divide into 2 and a new church is planted. And although the house church has relatively small numbers, there are always going to be 2 leaders, a senior and an apprentice. And the senior's task is to train the apprentice so that when the house church reaches its maximum numbers, then the group can divide into 2 and a new church planted. The senior will go into the new church, and the apprentice will stay in the old church but become a senior. And then the 2 seniors will appoint apprentices so that as both churches reach their maximum numbers, they can divide into 2 and new churches planted. So that's size. Then secondly, style. Now style is determined by size. Because the church is relatively small, then the meetings can be participatory and all-inclusive. The house church ought to be a place which is marked by accountability and responsibility. That is, the church is a place where we look after other people and other people look after us. It should be a place where there is no place to hide. The house church should be a place where we can connect relationally and grow spiritually. And the spirit of the house church is summed up in those memorable words in Hebrews 10:24-25. Let us encourage one another, considering how we may spur one another on to love and to good deeds. So we've looked at size and we've looked at style. And now we want to look at simplicity. If size determines style, then size and style determine simplicity. That is, the house church is almost maintenance free. The house in which we meet costs nothing. There is no expensive building to buy, to hire or to maintain. And the leadership may be run on a voluntary basis, with the leaders perhaps having secular employment, either full-time or part-time. And since every member of the house group will be encouraged to promote the welfare of the church by both deliberate and regular activity, then the task of leading will never be too onerous. And there'll always be two leaders, the senior and apprentice. So the task of shepherding, to teach, to lead, to feed, to protect, is always a shared task. So size determines style, and size and style together determine simplicity. But now the fourth characteristic, and that is one of self-replication. Now size keeps self-replication always in view. Because the numbers will always be relatively small, and the home is relatively small, then self-replication will never be far away. Now if size keeps self-replication in view, then style and simplicity facilitate self-replication. It makes self-replication more easy. We can think of this, first of all, in contrast to the traditional method of church planting. In the traditional method of church planting, there is an emphasis on a hired building or a building that's bought, so there is a cost of money. Or it may be that we engage in gathering a team of people and appointing a team in order to do this work. And then there is a plethora of meetings which are arranged for the public so that we can give publicity to this emerging church. Whereas in the house church movement, none of that needs to go on. The house church has grown, it has leadership in place, it divides into two, a new church is formed, this new church finds a new house to meet in, and then the church begins to grow as before, and hopefully soon divide and plant another church. So in the house church movement, self-replication is relatively easy. But style and simplicity facilitate self-replication in another area. In the more traditional church, the area of church planting is usually done where the church feels at home socially and culturally. It rarely works in areas which is alien to its experience and to its comfort zone. But not so with the house church. The house church can easily work in alien areas, areas that it's not overly familiar with. So for example, it can work in areas of persecution, such as, say, for example, North Korea or China, or areas of deprivation, such as in the inner cities of the British Isles. So we've looked at size, we've looked at style, we've looked at simplicity, and we've looked at self-replication. And now the last chief characteristic is one of strategy. House churches need strategy because they are so fragile. The more traditional church may have its purpose statement, but it rarely has a strategy for church planting. And if it has one of a kind, it tends to be a verbal one, not one that is written down. And so often the vision of church planting is quite vague. It fulfills that age-old maxim that if you aim at nothing, then you're sure to hit it. So what is the strategy of the house church? Well, it consists of two things. First of places, and then of people. Let's deal with places first. In the house church, there are these two complementary ideas. There is a private home needed for church fellowship, and a public place is needed for gospel preaching. This preaching is a ministry of God's word undertaken in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And this life-impacting preaching will fuel the growth of the house churches. As more people come to the public meeting of preaching and are converted, then they will be directed into the house churches that support this public place of preaching. And the house churches and those who preach at this public place for preaching will have to decide what day these meetings are held and what time and how frequent. And because one size does not fit all, then much care and prayer is needed in order to get this right. So that's the first part of the strategy. It has to do with places. But then there's a second part, and it has to do with people. The house church has two leaders, a senior and an apprentice. We can think of them as the shepherds and teachers of the church. And they have a twofold task. They are to prepare God's people for works of service, Ephesians 4:11 and 12. And they are to train future leaders for the house church, 2 Timothy 2:2. And so while there is two leaders in place and the church begins to grow, then the church is ready to divide into two and plant another church. So we have strategy, people and places. Places and people. And it's this vision of these key characteristics that the house church must always keep in view if it is to fulfill its mission and not to fail in its objectives. So those are the 5 key characteristics: size, style, simplicity, self-replication, and strategy. Now, we said that we would look at those key characteristics and see how they distinguish the house church from the more traditional church. Let's just do this for a few minutes, one by one. Take size. The more traditional church aspires to be a mega church, whereas the house church is concerned as it grows to divide into two and plant another church. Or take the idea of style. The more traditional church on a Sunday meeting is a meeting which is governed by the few, while the majority look on as spectators to the event. Whereas in the house church, the meeting is participatory and all-inclusive. So what about simplicity? Well, the more traditional church is a church that is expensive and requires a healthy budget. Whereas in the house church is largely maintenance free. Or take self-replication. The more traditional church can go many years and not self-replicate at all. There are churches in this land that have been in existence for 100, even 200 years and have never ever planted a church. Whereas the house church, in a sense, exists for that very reason, to grow and divide, to grow and divide, constantly seeking to plant new churches. And then lastly, there is strategy. The traditional house church rarely has a strategy for church planting, whereas in the house church, it is a part of the house church's DNA. If there is no strategy, there will be complacency. And if there is complacency, that will lead to stagnation. And stagnation eventually will lead to the demise of the house church. These 5 key characteristics are a great indicator as to whether the local church is being faithful in fulfilling its obligations and bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth.